Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our combined Brasenose College, St Catharine's College, and Selwyn College interview workshops. We are now past the UCAS application deadline, so hopefully you've all submitted your applications and are eagerly awaiting to hear if you've got an interview. And we're doing this session today to kind of show you what it's going to be like to get an interview from PPE or Oxford or something like economics at Cambridge. So it's really great to see so many of you here, and we hope you find this session useful. My name's Liza. I work at St Catharine's College in Cambridge. I'm going to be kind of doing the outline of the session, but I'm going to hand over to our PPE experts later on for the actual mock interview session. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Ian Carroll. I'm a politics tutor at Brasenose College, Oxford. So I teach lots of PPE students, but also some history and politics students. I don't usually teach E&M, but I guess I do meet them around. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Hi, I'm Freya. I'm a second year PPE student studying at Brasenose.
Who has very kindly and bravely volunteered to be interviewed in this session. Fabulous. I've got all the questions that you guys have submitted in the application form, but if any questions do come up whilst we're going through the session, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll have a little bit of time at the end to answer those questions. So with that, I'm going to hand straight over to Dr. Carroll and Freya. So take it away, guys.
Thanks. So I thought I'd just say a couple of things about the logistics of interviews to start with, just to kind of get the ball rolling. So at least if you're applying to Oxford, I'm not sure exactly how this will work, Cambridge, but if you're applying to Oxford for PPE or E&M, you'll generally have at least 2 interviews like this. Sometimes 3, depends. Colleges and different subjects do things a little bit differently. Sometimes there'll be kind of single subject interviews. So it'll be just a politics interview or just an economics interview. And sometimes there'll be mixed interviews. So here at Brasenose, we tend to do mixed interviews. We tend to do 3 interviewers and a P, and an E in each interview. And I find that quite helpful personally. I like seeing. I'm generally focused on politics, but I like seeing how students handle the other subjects as well. It kind of gives me a useful information about their candidacy. So usually you'll have 2 to 3 interviewers as well, and they'll generally take turns answering questions. So they could jump in. We've tended to find, I think, over the last couple of years that usually it's easier over something like Teams or Zoom to just take turns asking questions. But sometimes you might have someone who's not the primary person asking me the question come in with a follow-up question or something like that. We won't have that today, I guess, because it's just me and Freya here. But that could happen as well. Let me say that there might be kind of a few different types of questions you could get asked in an interview. So sometimes you might have a reading comprehension piece. So you might be set short, a couple paragraphs to read before the interview. And then the interview will be about kind of talking you through, well, what did you take from it? Sometimes the kind of certain details will have been excluded from the passage, so you might have to deduce from what you've read when it was written or what the context might have been. So that's one kind of question you can get. What was the main? Was there an argument in the piece, or what kind of content? What kind of important points might we take from the piece? That's one kind of broad type of question. It's quite popular. It means everyone's reading the same piece of literature going into the interview, and so we can get a kind of standard test for how people are approaching it. A second kind of question might be something like just a straight up question. When you just get asked a question, you respond, and the conversation goes from there. We might give one of those a try in a minute with Freya. And the third type of question maybe is kind of more like a scenario-based question, or a problem question, or a game to play. And the economists tend to be quite fond of those, though I've used them for politics as well. Politics people might also ask you, kind of give you a graph or kind of some data and say, okay, well, here, take a look at this. What do you think about it? What kind of conclusions might we draw from this graph? So those are the kinds of questions you might get asked broadly speaking. So we're not going to take a look at any reading comprehension today because we wouldn't have read what we've read. But we might take a look at one of each of the other two types of questions, just to give you an idea of how they might go, how the conversation might go. So with that in mind, I guess, Freya, if you're okay, I might ask you a question.
Okay, go for it.
So let's start with a kind of straight up question. Do you think that political violence can ever be justified?
What do you mean by political violence, or is that for me to decide?
I've already taught Freya last year, and so she knows all the my tricks. And so, yeah, so the first question I guess we need to think about is, well, what does the question mean? What do we mean by political violence? So what do you think political violence means? What is it?
I would say political violence is kind of violent means for a political end. So kind of any action that constitutes violence that then leads to some kind of political goal being achieved or making progress towards that political goal, or even kind of where the aim is to make progress towards that political goal.
So what makes a means of doing something violent?
I guess there's different types. So the most obvious to me is physical violence. So if it involves kind of maybe, well, I guess physical violence, so that's like physically harming another person. I guess if to consider it violence, to me, there's intention behind that. It's not like an accident kind of thing. It wouldn't be political violence if I was on the way to driving to a protest and then on the way I accidentally kind of ran someone over with my car, right? That wouldn't be political violence to me, even though my end is to get to the protest, which would further the political cause. So I would say like intentional harming of another is one form of political violence. I'm not sure if I would consider as part of this question any other kind of forms. I guess you can have like verbal violence sometimes, maybe. So if I was maybe like harassing you as you were like, if I'm like someone who's preaching on the street, but instead of kind of being peaceful about it, I'm like going up to you and I'm screaming in your ear, and like I guess that could be counted as political violence as well. Yeah. So actually, no, I take it back. I do count that as well. So verbal violence and physical violence, I think.
So suppose that I'm an animal rights activist, as we've had here in Oxford from time to time, and I plant an incendiary device in a lab that's used for animal-based experiments. Am I engaging in political violence?
I think there's two ways that I would go about thinking about that. The first one would be kind of, I wonder if it maybe would depend on whether you kind of marked that as, you know what I mean, whether it was like a publicity thing, or whether you were just doing it to stop the animal, like the violation of animal rights. I guess it depends on that way, like kind of track. It depends what your political goal actually is. I think if
Is what I've done violence?
Yes, because you're intentionally harming another person.
Who am I harming?
True. I guess it depends the context of the action then, as in whether it's violent or not. So as in if it was in the middle of the day and you snuck in during the lunch break and then you sat there in the corridor, waited for everyone to go in and then set it off, then you're doing it to harm the people who are in there. If you do it in the middle of the night and then you set it off when you know there's nobody in there, then maybe it's not violence because it's not harming anybody.
So it's not violent to set off a bomb in an unoccupied lab.
True. Maybe I need to change my definition of violence then.
So how were you defining it before?
Before I was defining it as violence was intentional harm to another person, or at least one other person. I guess could violence also be like intentional disruption or damage? But then if I sort of like, if I went outside the front of college and like kind of hit it with like a hammer or something, and then a bit of the brick fell off. I've intentionally damaged college, but I've not been violent against. Oh, have I? I'm not sure. Maybe I have been violent against college. So to go back to my original definition, I originally said that violence was intentionally harming another person, and now I'm saying violence could be the intentional damage to others or things. Doesn't sound too promising.
What are you worried about? Why would that not work?
It feels too broad, I think. Intentional damage to things doesn't feel like all of that could be violence, you know? Like if I I don't know. Well, my example was going to be if I used like an eraser, then I damaged the eraser by using it, but then I guess that's not necessarily intentional damage to the eraser, because that's more of a byproduct of me intending to rub off my pencil off my paper. Trying to think so. Like, okay, what if I intentionally like snapped a breadstick? I don't know why. It's like part of a party game or something. I'm intentionally damaging this breadstick, but it's not violence. So that's why it feels like it's too broad, I think, because it would encompass other things that I don't consider to be violence.
Yeah, that seems right. So let's try a different example. Suppose I'm a bank robber and I want to use dynamite to blow the doors off a vault. And in doing so, one of the guards in the bank gets injured by flying masonry. Have I acted violently?
I think yes, but I think it doesn't depend on whether or not the guard is damaged. The guard is damaged, you know what I mean? The guard is harmed by your action. I think that what the mistake I originally made maybe was to put in kind of the harming another as the condition of violence. I think that like with the other one, I think setting off a bomb in a factory is violent, and it's not determined externally by whether there's someone there to harm or not.
Do you think I intentionally harmed the guard?
No.
Why not?
I think maybe the answer's a bit more complex than a no. I think maybe if it depends on whether you could have foreseen that the guard was there. So as in, was it negligence on your part that meant that the guard got harmed? Or is that the same thing as intention? Maybe it's not. As in, I guess if he's just it's like, you know, I think intention implies that you directly thought that was your aim, kind of thing, you know? Whereas if the guard was harmed as like a side effect of what you were doing to achieve a different aim, but I guess it's whether the side effect is like foreseeable enough. Like, I don't know, if I wanted to, this is just an example, but if I wanted to like run over person A, right, and person B was standing in front of person A, and I knew to run over person A, I would need to run over person B, like foreseeably, like I'm not going to be able to run over person A without running over person B. They're literally stood right next to each other. Then, and I still did it anyway, I might be intending on harming person A, but I don't think I could say that I unintentionally harmed person B.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so sum up for me. What is violence? So far as we've gotten so far.
As far as we've gotten, some kind of intentional damage or harm. But then I think the two bit is what's concerning me mainly, because it's not to just other people, because I think that it is violent just to bomb an empty building. But then I don't think that it's all things, and I'm not really sure where to draw that distinction. I think that's what I'm struggling with now.
Is there a difference between bombing an empty building and demolishing it using explosives?
I think so, because if you're demolishing it using explosives, it's in a controlled and in a controlled environment, that's kind of, yeah, I don't think it's violent to demolish an empty building using explosives, even though the same explosives are involved.
But it is violent to plant a bomb and let it explode in an empty building.
I think so, yeah. So there must be some difference that's lying in between those two cases.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that is yet.
No, neither.
I think I agree with your intuitions here, but I'm not sure what the difference is.
I guess the building, when you're demolishing the building, I guess it's part of it maybe is that it's expected, but then equally, you know, I could be walking down the street and then the building just suddenly starts getting demolished. You know, that doesn't, I wasn't expecting it. But then equally, you know, there's probably going to be like taped off areas. I guess maybe precautions are taken as well, but then that doesn't feel general enough to apply it to the whole of violence. But if we focus just on this case, you know, if you're gonna controlledly, like if you're going to demolish a building using explosives, it's going to be in a controlled environment. You're going to take precautions to make sure that people are safe. You're going to let people know what time, you know, the neighbors and all that kind of thing, what time it's happening, when it's happening, that kind of thing. There's going to be people wearing like hard hats and high-vis jackets kind of walking around. They're going to have cordoned off the area, so it will be signaled to everyone kind of what's going on. And it's not threatening in nature, maybe, is something, or not.
Do you think an execution is violent?
It doesn't really sit right with me to say this, but no.
Okay.
Like,
why not? What's the difference? It's intentional harm, right?
yeah. I don't know. I actually think my intuition is a bit like unclear on whether it is violent. I think I will go with no, it's not. And I think it is that same controlled, expected, planned. I want to say official, but I know that kind of is a bit too kind of that relies on kind of things that are naturally there, if you understand what I mean. But and also I guess it's also like execution. Maybe I think that, I don't know, like executing a American prisoner on death row with a kind of lethal injection is not violent, but an execution of someone in the town square by like a terrorist group who's taken over like a city or something, maybe that is violent.
So is it ever the case that agents of the state, say people who work for the government, act violently?
Yes.
Such as?
Police violence, I think, as in, and obviously that's using violence, but I think like when the police kind of go outside of their realm of like what they're charged to do and kind of the set boundaries of that, when they go outside of that in kind of a way that causes more harm than necessary, or like than within that realm.
I can see that. So suppose we're just thinking about police officers who are acting exactly as the law requires them to act. Are they just by definition not acting violently?
True. I guess it's conditional on the law as well. Like if I change the law and went, oh well, no, it's okay for a police officer to kill whoever they fancy, then they're still acting within the law, but they're acting violently, in my opinion.
What about a soldier?
I think war is violent, even though it's state sanctioned. Even though within the socially accepted role of a soldier is to kill someone, I still think that's violent.
Okay, so what conclusion should we draw then about the role of officialdom or official sanction when it comes to analyzing violence?
I think maybe it's not part of the definition of violence, but it's kind of more related to the perception of violence.
Okay.
So maybe
Well,
actually I need to challenge my own kind of intuitions about things, because like why do I see what I'm used to as a law and what I'm used to as kind of social norms and stuff, why does that affect what I see as violence? Maybe if I came from like a different background, where they had different laws and they were used to like executions in like a town square, for example, like maybe I wouldn't see that as violent. And maybe that's kind of, I don't know, I think maybe it needs to be taken out of what our definition of violence is. Or maybe it just means that violence is actually more subjective than we're kind of giving it credit for in this discussion.
why don't we turn to the other half of the problem? You referred to ends or goals when you were talking about political violence and how you might conceptualize political violence. What makes an end or a goal political?
Um, good question. I guess one way to look at it would be in terms of kind of looking at it more from the kind of state form, so changing something social, like about like our kind of like the political things, like people protesting for changes in laws. The change in the law is the political end, political being kind of within the political system that we live in, sort of thing. So kind of related to governance of a society. But then I think, does that encompass all? I guess some people would say more like ideology based stuff is also political. And your political end doesn't necessarily need to be to change the way in which we're governed. That feels too narrow. As in, maybe it could be to change like opinions and things like that. I still think that's political. Because you could even have it within kind of like change people supporting one. I was going to say to change people supporting like one political party versus supporting another political party, but I guess that could at the end it like who you support depends on what policies they might implement and all of that kind of thing. But then also it can depend on ideology, so it's a bit of a mixed one. And then I was going to sort of bring in issues like abortion and things like that, whether they're political issues or whether they're just politicized and actually at the core maybe they're not political ends and kind of questions and goals. I don't know. I think maybe they're more like, maybe that is a separate thing. Maybe we should separate out kind of the more like cultural and ethical questions from political goals. But then again, at the core of politics, I feel is definitely a lot of ethics, so, and culture. So maybe that's not possible to separate them.
Yeah, so feminists famously claim that the personal is political. Are they confused?
I don't think so, because I think that even if we do go with the definition of political as related to the governance of a society can be governed to an extent that it is personal.
What does that mean?
As in, you can have laws, countries across the world have laws relating to people's sexualities, people's like kind of healthcare and rights related to their own healthcare in their own life, even rights related to like whether or not this is kind of right or wrong, it's within the political sphere to regulate like families. So for example, like how a parent chooses to like punish their child, or how many children you want to like you choose to have, as much as maybe not in kind of our country, but definitely like one child policy in China in the past and things like that. It's all part of the like political sphere that may not be regulated by a government, but can be regulated by government. Equally, feminists, if they're kind of, if we were talking about kind of more back in like kind of the early 1900s, late 19th century as well. I guess the regulation was very much so personal to women, in terms of, you know, they're forbidden from requesting a divorce from their husband, forbidden from working, forbidden from kind of, even in some countries today, forbidden from kind of driving or even leaving the house without a male escort. That's definitely personal and definitely also political. So I don't think they're mistaken, no.
So it seems like there are lots of areas of life that existing states regulate or manage. There are, at least in some countries, lots of areas of life that the state doesn't regulate or manage. Are there any areas of life that the state couldn't regulate?
I think it depends on what we mean by regulation. So because my initial thought was kind of, I was trying to think of something that would be so personal that it couldn't be regulated by the state, as in terms of if it's inaccessible. And obviously my first thought in that instance was thoughts kind of thing, and people's like consciousness almost. But then if you think about how the state can control, I guess historically one of the things that's incredibly important in that is religion, and then kind of historically also, but a lot more kind of in modern times, education. So if you are educated, like in theory, we could have a government where all of the kind of almost Plato Republic-esque, all of the children are taken away from their parents when they're born, and then they're raised by the state. And if they are raised by the state, then everything that they learn can be indoctrinated into them through education by the state. I'm not saying that this happens, but more that, like, as in, surely that would shape even your thoughts. Surely then the state could even regulate your thoughts. But then I guess you have to think about like this whole nature nurture sort of thing, as in, is it all nurture? I think to assume that the state could regulate your entire thoughts in that way would be to assume that everything about our minds and things like that are by nurture and not by nature. So you could argue that you might have kind of natural intuitions that can't be regulated, because no matter what indoctrination you kind of receive, even from being a baby, maybe you will still have those like natural intuitions that can't be regulated because they are so like deeply internal.
If we have a very broad understanding of what kinds of ends or goals might count as political, is it the case that essentially all violence is going to be political violence?
I think not. I think like imagine like a fight outside of a pub between two brothers over who is going to pay for the pints. Is that political? I think probably not. I don't think that fight, even when extended, falls into kind of anything ideological or related to governance.
We might think that there's a question of distributive justice lurking in the background there, but who should pay?
True. Let's say that they have been given, they live in a lovely cheap world, or they've been to Brasenose College bar with all the cheap pints there, and they've been given a £5 note by their mum to pay for the drinks, and they're arguing over who gets to hand the £5 note to the person behind the bar. Is that still distributive justice in terms
Probably
of...
not. Okay. Let's kind of come back to our original question, right? So we started off with the idea, just straight up, is political violence ever justified? Could political violence ever be justified? We've been talking a little bit about what political violence might be, but going back to our question, so under what circumstances, if any, might political violence be justified?
I think it could be justified when non-violent means are not enough, but then I think the issue with that is, I guess you would have to extend that to say are not enough to meet kind of maybe a fundamental end. And I guess it becomes desired by who. How do we know that that end is worthy? Because I think not all ends are worthy. So, for example, if someone's end was to reintroduce segregation into society or apartheid, I personally don't think that that's a worthy end to resort to political violence to bring about. However, obviously, an example of political violence could be the suffragettes. And I think years and years of campaigning non-violently didn't do anything. So I think maybe they were justified in acting violently politically to achieve their end of equal suffrage.
So
But
they were justified in order to achieve the end of equal suffrage. They were justified in intentionally harming other people.
I know that I've just said yes, but it just doesn't really like feel intuitively right to say that. I think maybe suffrage isn't the right example. I think we imagined like an oppressed people maybe underneath a violent colonizer, who have tried to get independence, for, you know, and they're treated unfairly, they're treated unequally, they're treated violently, they're like, even we could even say they're systematically killed. I think if they try, but then even, I mean, I guess it's, I was going to say if they've tried non-violent means first, and kind of by that sense, obviously I'm looking at violent means as kind of a second option. I mean, should they really have to try non-violent means in that scenario? I don't know. I think maybe not. Especially if it's going to, you know, if you're looking at the characteristic of this oppressor, if they are violent, then it's probably going to result in more like deaths and loss for them if they do try non-violent means first, with what I would imagine to be little success, if this is kind of the oppressor that I've just described. But I think, what was the original question? Sorry.
Well, so the original question was when, if ever, might political violence be justified? And our question, given how you were understanding political violence, it sounded like it existed. It was intentionally harming other people. That's what took us to the example of the suffragettes, and you were a little bit nervous about saying that even for something quite important like suffrage, intentionally harming other people might be justified. And then we moved on to kind of, I guess, more extreme examples.
Yeah, so it was whether suffrage could justify intentionally harming others. So I guess whether the independence, which would lead to the, let's imagine that it's certain that it would lead to the freedom for, justice for, equality for the people who have been previously oppressed. So those are kind of the ends that we're going towards. I think that they would be justified in intentionally harming others to achieve those things. I guess something that would be interesting to look at could be whether if they had none of those things, but they weren't being violently treated by their oppressor, would it also be justified? Or would it only be justified as a secondary means after non-violence? Again, I'm not really doing a very good job of answering the questions. I'm just asking questions.
That's okay. Why don't we pause, just kind of stop kind of asking and answering those questions, just kind of to reflect on the process of the question. And so yeah, that was probably quite a bit longer than an interview question would be. I would usually have about 7 minutes to have that conversation with you in an interview. So I think we can talk for about half an hour about it. So we've gotten to go into a lot more detail, but it was kind of interesting to see your thought process. So I think it was useful. But yeah, so what did you think of the question? How did you find it? How did you think through it? How did you approach it?
So I tried to be, this is much more because I've had you as a tutor before. But actually your tutorials have made me realize that it's so important to think carefully about what you mean when you say certain words. So like, because you will, I think the main half of this conversation was just me figuring out what a potential definition for violence could be. So definitely kind of, I would try to be careful in what I was saying in terms of what I meant precisely by words and keeping that consistent, because I think we aren't consistent when we speak colloquially with each other. We use violence to mean so many different things, and it means something different in everyone else's head. But to have this conversation, we need to be on the same page about what that means. And then I also just try to like think, just share my thought process and let you, Ian, know what I was thinking, so that I could so that I guess you could see if I do kind of stray slightly, you can either challenge that or sort of know where to bring me back to, I guess. So yeah, just thinking out loud and showing my thought process, so that you can help me on the way, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I mean, this kind of question is designed to test a couple of kind of intellectual skills. One, I think you're right, is about precision. So it's about, words mean things, and we're trying to be very precise about language, so we can make kind of subtle distinctions and fine distinctions. When we come to study these things in more detail later, we want to be able to kind of be very precise about how language is being used. The other thing is, as you noted, is about consistency, right? So we're going to run into problems if the meanings of terms are shifting through arguments. And so I guess part of the things I'm listening for is whether you're being consistent about how you're using the terms, whether you can see that there might be two different ways in which you're using a term and why that might be a problem. And then if I can kind of call your attention to it, how do you respond to that, right? Can you kind of remember that, oh, okay, that I've used those two terms to mean two different things already, and now, okay, it's been pointed out to me. Can you then go and say, oh, okay, well, let's not make that same mistake again? So can you be consistent from that point on? So yeah, initially using the terms in an imprecise way or an inconsistent way isn't really a problem in an interview, right? Because the interviewer will kind of interject to clarify, but then whether or not how you respond to that clarification, I guess, is one of the things we're interested in. Liza, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer some of my observations from your call.
Oh, that's great.
First of all, Freya, well, great job. I thought that was brilliant. But you'll notice that Freya, kind of initially when you posed that question, she kind of paused and thought, didn't straight away jump into answering the question, which is absolutely fine. A lot of people